Welcome to the deep dive for this week. Don't forget to visit the website at deepdiveau.net. Check out our socials and Patreon page at the Deep Dive AU. Subscribe via your favorite podcast app or like and subscribe at our YouTube page at the Deep Dive AU.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Annie Crowe is a human rights lawyer, disability and mental health advocate, and the founder and lead consultant of NeuroAccess, a consultancy specializing in equity and accessibility for neurodivergent people. Annie is a globally recognized thought leader on neurodiversity and speaks at national and international conferences on the topics of neurodiversity, disability and mental health. She frequently appears in federal, state and territory parliamentary inquiries to give a voice to the neurodivergent community as an expert in autistic rights and neuroaccessibility. She has just launched her safe self-advocacy method at the Yellow Ladybugs conference in Melbourne a few months back and has just launched the awesome NeuroEss Network for neurodivergent adults. Welcome, Annie, to the deep dive.
Thank you for having me, Michael. It's exciting to be here.
I know there's been a couple of sort of delays, but we finally got here in the end. So can you explain?
Queen of delays. Most people who work with me or know me know that I am queen of delays.
Yeah, fair enough.
Unashamedly, because, that's an access issue for a lot of us.
Yeah, fair enough. So can you explain the concept of neuroaccessibility and why is it important for neurodivergent individuals?
Neuroaccessibility is when the needs of neurodivergent people are specifically considered and products, services, environments, and systems are built or modified so that they can be used by people of all neurotypes. No shocker there. So, but why is it important, I guess, is the crucial aspect. So, really, for me, accessibility is such a powerful word, and I prefer it to what's popularly used, what's often used around accommodations and reasonable adjustments, which is the legal terminology, right? But for me, accessibility is a proactive method, okay? So it's proactively thinking about how we can create access for people. Whereas to provide someone with an accommodation or reasonable adjustments, it's very reactive, it's very individual. It's, it's not really based on universal design or trying to support everyone in those communities. Which makes it harder on a personal access level as well, because if you're just fighting for your access needs, you have a much heavier burden on your shoulders than if these systems and environments are providing access to your community. So, for example, if, let's say, shopping centers had so many more low sensory sessions. Most of them these days will have an hour a week at the most ridiculous time, usually in the middle of a workday, for low sensory shopping where they reduce the lights and the music. If you're the only one having to fight for that as an individual, it's so much harder than if the business was thinking, how can we support the access needs of this whole community, of all the neurodivergent people that would benefit from this, who would be able to actually get their groceries without any harm. You know what I mean? So it's really, it's much more of a proactive and inclusive sort of element to it. And I like to teach organizations about it because, if you're waiting for the individual to come up and ask for their accommodations and reasonable adjustments, then you're not doing access right.
Yeah, exactly. So what are the common barriers to neuroaccessibility in products, services and environments?
Yeah, so one of the barriers, there's a lot, but I think, some of the biggest barriers that sort of face our community in terms of having their access needs met is, sensory overload is a really big one. Complex communication and the double empathy problem about how autistic people communicate in a different way to non-autistic or holistic people. A lot of us really prefer direct, explicit, really easy to follow language and information. Another popular one in workplaces is the what, why, and by when. Making sure when you're giving a task to a neurodivergent employee, you're being really explicit about what you expect of them, when you want it by, and why it's important. The why doesn't seem to be as important to a lot of neurotypical staff. They just like a bit more willing to accept what the boss says. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them could be that they might buy into the hierarchy a bit more than often, especially autistic people tend to not really follow the hierarchy, which is actually quite interesting. Sidebar. I hear
We
a
like
lot about,
sarcasm in the Deep Dive podcast.
we like side quests, don't we?
Exactly.
I hear a lot of people talking about hierarchy and autism, right? And so much of the time I hear it. I was just listening to a podcast this morning and they were talking about how we autistic people just don't see hierarchy. And I don't really agree with that on a personal level. Maybe that is true for some autistic people, but for me, I'm very aware of hierarchy. I just blatantly don't agree with it because I think all humans hold equal value. And so for me, the thought of having someone in a company or a business who has more say and more, flexibility and control and everything than someone down here, or is valued higher, that just doesn't really align with my core values, which are very deep in equality and equity. So I don't necessarily agree for me that it's that I don't see hierarchy personally, my flavor of neurodivergence, but for me, it's really a matter of I just don't agree with it. And I think everyone holds equal values. So I think that can come into the why, but bringing it back to the what, by, when, and why is like, I want to know why, because if you're making me do this task and I think it's not a reasonable like reason for it, then I want to be able to unpack that with you and maybe even help you find a more efficient way or help you overcome the challenge you think this task is going to fix that I know it won't,
And that sort of goes into the PDA sort of method, doesn't it?
It does. There's definitely some PDA in there.
Fair enough, fair enough. So how can organisations and businesses modify their systems to be more accessible to the community?
Yeah. So, we talk about rigid structures and expectations, lack of predictability. So trying to create more flexible work policies is a big one. I mean, flexible practices help so many more people than just neurodivergent people, from single parents to chronically ill, more broadly to the disabled community, women who are still primary carers. I actually did my law thesis on flexible work practices in Australian private law firms, which, looking back, the main motivation for me there was that I knew that I would never be able to do a traditional private law firm job. So at the time I was working in a top tier law firm and they were working 12-hour days and I just couldn't hack the 12-hour days.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Not. And so I kind of went at this from a feminist lens of, well, I wanted to be a mum one day. But for me, it was nothing to do with being a mum or being a woman. It was, I didn't realize I was neurodivergent and needed that flexibility. So it's, improving communication methods like we spoke about, direct, clear language, multiple channels of communication. Some people are more verbal, more visual, more having options for people to communicate is really helpful as well. And visual supports can be helpful. Obviously, redesigning hiring and onboarding processes is critical and gets a lot of attention in terms of recruitment and how many barriers exist for the neurodivergent community in recruitment, from biases to just complete lack of acknowledging our strengths and being able to shine as the individuals we are rather than having the neuronormative values placed on us in those processes. Creating sensory environments, training and education in neurodiversity. I talk at a lot of businesses. There's a lot of neurodiversity employee resource groups popping up, similar to like LGBTQIA plus groups, and it's offering your staff an area to safely connect with each other and support each other through some of the shared challenges they may face in the workplace. And I'm a huge fan of assistive technology. So being able to leverage assistive technology in the workplace can be really helpful depending on where you work. Inclusive policies, continuous feedback and improvement, not to the individual. I'm not talking about performance reviews here. I'm talking about like making sure that you're constantly checking in and evaluating your processes to ensure that they are inclusive, taking that universal design approach. It's just, critical.
Yeah, and I know sort of like, it's checking in on the employees' mental health as well, which I think is sort of so important these days.
Totally.
So, can you describe the relationship between self-advocacy and neuroaccessibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, self-advocacy is the tool to gaining neuroaccessibility. Until we live in a society where neuroaccessibility is normalized and thought about all the time, which currently is absolutely not the case, um, self-advocacy is necessary. So I sort of say I would love to not have to teach self-advocacy, because it is a burden that our community shouldn't, have to take on. But until we reach that ideal, it's the way that we can get our needs met, essentially. So it's being able to personalize our accessibility needs. It's a way to find autonomy and empowerment, raising awareness and education, advancing inclusion, and obviously, like, most importantly to me, is protecting our rights and well-being.
Okay. So, can you briefly explain your safe self-advocacy method and how it will help neurodivergent individuals prioritize their safety?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my SAFE method, and the reason I chose SAFE as the acronym, was actually, I based it on a military concept called the OODA loop, OODA. So I didn't reinvent the wheel. I like to cross-pollinate a lot of research I do in everything from leadership, psychology, philosophy. And so really, SAFE is so critical to me because everything I do is about prioritizing safety for my clients and myself in my own life and my loved ones who are mostly neurodivergent. And so SAFE stands for study, align, find, and execute. So step one, study your environment. Essentially, that means understanding your environment, identifying your needs. This phase is a very curiosity-based phase where you're just gathering information, looking for potential barriers, and sort of trying to figure out what's going on around you and what do you need to address. And step two, align your goals with your rights. Obviously, a lot of the time in self-advocacy, we talk about knowing your rights and how important that is. But I also like to talk about aligning your goals and values with your rights, because as you would know, Michael, and I've definitely experienced, a lot of us get told what we should want or what we should do. And this is where, like, masking and burnout can become a thing. And so really, when I'm helping people unpack some of the barriers they're up against and how they're going to fix them, I like to make sure that the ideal outcome that they want is really self-motivated and sits, like, true to them and isn't coming from a place of what do they think they should want, which a lot of us have sort of grilled into us from a young age, and it takes a lot of effort to unpack that with unmasking and such. But really, it's about ensuring that decision making is self-motivated rather than influenced by societal expectations. And then find strategies and supports, pretty basic, identifying resources, strategies, supports that will help you achieve your goal or ideal outcome, essentially. So this is looking at things like accommodations, support systems, where can you go to get support? Is it through NDIS? Is it through Medicare? Is it through family? Is it through workplace adjustments? Sort of figuring out what are your options, essentially. And then step four is basically choosing the path you want to take out of all those options you've identified and doing it. And so with that, you want to go into that feeling quite confident because you've done this analysis of what's your best or most effective path forward. May or may not work, but you're feeling quite informed in your choices. And also knowing that whatever happens with whatever choice you choose, you're using that information as feedback, and you can literally just rinse and repeat the whole process. And each time you go into the start again, starting up at studying your environment, you're getting more input that can help you make more informed decisions about your own autonomy and safety, right?
That's correct. So, how can understanding and knowing one's rights enhance self advocacy for neurodivergent and autistic individuals?
Yes. Well, this is my favorite question because, I mean, essentially, the most important thing is that knowing your rights can give you so much empowerment and confidence, because when we don't know our rights, we feel so much less confident in speaking up for our needs. We don't feel like our needs are valid. We might feel quite isolated and alone in our needs. So knowing your rights can really help you with that empowerment and confidence to speak up. Um, another one is navigating barriers to resistance is really important. So addressing any pushback that you might get or invalidation. Often when many of us speak up, we are dismissed because we're not understood and because our experience is so different. And that's something that knowing your rights and how to communicate them effectively can really help, because rather than getting blocked at that stage, which many of us do, it gives you the tools to push through and break those barriers and break that systemic injustice that you're up against, that's so hard to identify for a lot of people, and until you can really start to break it all down. But yeah, essentially for me, I think one of the biggest things is really addressing, the internalized ableism that a lot of us have. We get so many more negative messages as like from a very young age. The main stat thrown around is like 20,000 more negative messages by age 12 for ADHDers, right? And so yeah, it's huge for autistic. It's huge for all neurodivergent people. And what that does is you form a very harsh inner critic, and you really start to basically tell yourself that your needs don't matter, that you're being too much or too sensitive. And these messages that you tell yourself are coming from the outside, right? We've internalized them. And so for me, I think the most important thing in knowing your rights is to fight that voice, along with things like self-compassion can be a really powerful tool, and self-acceptance. But I think most importantly is knowing that your needs are valid and that you deserve to have your access needs met is just so powerful.
Okay, sounds good. So, what role does community connection play in the safe self-advocacy method?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of community, Michael,
That's
as one
correct.
of my network members. So, yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, we talk about collective action, we talk about finding connection and community through, a safe place where you can unmask and be your authentic self, but also find people who have had similar barriers and challenges. Putting your collective heads together to solve a lot of these problems can be really powerful, as we see in the network all the time. But community is so important for really building that sense of well-being and again, healing from a lot of that trauma and internalized ableism that we experience. If you think about constantly being told bad things about yourself, then finding community where you've got other people who might not be the exact same as you, but have similar differences and have had similar negative messages thrown at them, can be really healing, because all of a sudden you're in this space where you know that those messages are not true, and really they're coming from a place of ignorance and discrimination rather than any truth. So I think, yeah, community is so important in terms of healing and building your confidence and strength in fighting up and having your needs met and living a better life, which is essentially our goal at the end of the day, right? We all want to stop being in survival mode, which we're just dying in, literally, and start moving towards the privilege of being able to thrive, like neurotypicals, like able-bodied people, like anyone with a lot of.
Yeah, sounds good. So, also the fact that connecting with your neurokin is so important, because I think sort of having that connection is very therapeutic, and I found that myself. So, how can neurodivergent individuals ensure their self fulfillment needs are met in their personal and professional lives?
Yeah, so I think this is really important, and I think this can link up a lot with masking. And so many of us who have, I guess, the privilege of masking, which not all of us do, we mask to avoid harm, essentially. So the higher masking you are, the less likely you're going to face overt discrimination in society. But some of the challenges around that is masking essentially is almost rejecting your core values and not being your authentic self. So in terms of wanting to ensure you've got that self-fulfillment aspect met, it's not only about trying to build a safe environment where you can unmask more, which again, there's a lot of privilege in that, but it's also about being really clear on what your goals are, what you want in life, what your values are, and working towards ensuring that they're actually met, right? And that they're actually valued. So being able to advocate for your needs, being able to create supportive environments, becoming more self-aware and having more self-acceptance, setting really clear and meaningful goals around what's important to you, and doing meaningful work, which I think a lot of the time we talk about employment, and we all know that autistic and ADHD people are not only less likely to be employed, but they're also likely to be underemployed. So it's not even just about getting us in employment. It's actually about giving us meaningful work, right? I don't want to just be given a job for the sake of having a job. Like that's absolute bare minimum in terms of my right. But we all deserve to do work that is fulfilling and meaningful as well. So,
Yeah,
and
you
obviously
enjoy it
test that
more
out.
when you actually get that fulfillment and stuff like that in place, which I think is so important.
100%. Totally.
So how can neurodivergent individuals prepare for and manage potential setbacks in their self-advocacy journey?
Yeah. So, I mean, setbacks are they come with the territory, right? You're always going to face setbacks in self-advocating, and depending on what the environment is and the level of knowledge and awareness that the person or system that you're advocating against changes a lot of things. So, I guess just being very aware that setbacks happen and that self-advocacy is rarely a one-off conversation or a one-off email, and it's usually a bit of a back and forth of trying to really articulate your needs, but also bring whoever you're advocating, explaining things to, your access needs, on that journey of understanding and wanting them to feel really keen to actually take action and support you. So I think knowing that can really help, because when it happens, it can help you with rejection sensitivity. It can help you with, which, by the way, I disagree with the term rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD, because I think that our sensitive response to rejection is valid considering how much rejection we have. I don't really think it needs to be pathologized, but I think really understanding that you're going to experience pushback and that's normal, and having things in place to deal with that, whether it's going, to a trusted loved one, whether it's going to a community like, Michael, we have the network, and sharing your experience and getting help in processing that, whether it's seeing your therapist, whoever, just knowing that there is help and you don't have to process that alone, and that it's not a reflection on you as an individual, no matter what you're advocating for on an individual level. So recently, one of our network members needed to advocate for more clarity in an assignment at university, and they got flat out rejected when they tried to speak up to the lecturer, and the lecturer said no, that would be unfair to the other students. And that was the lecturer showing that they didn't understand equity to start with, and they also really had no idea what ADHD was. So what we did there to overcome it was to try to educate this lecturer and the university in understanding why this need was necessary. And so it really does take that back and forth in trying to bring them along in that journey, and knowing that you're actually not even just advocating for yourself here. You're advocating for every ADHD individual at that university, because we weren't just dealing with the lecturer, we were dealing with the disability and inclusion team. We were educating them on it, which actually ended up they're now doing a training for their entire staff on neurodiversity, which is exciting. And can you imagine now, like, the ADHD students coming through that space who will not have to go through that? I think one thing that really helps me, especially in my personal advocacy journey, which is always way harder than advocating for my clients or family or loved ones, is knowing that I'm helping, others or the greater purpose. I like to talk about a thing called the mama bear effect, which is essentially that, as a father yourself, Michael, you've got a kid and you do anything to protect them and speak up and shout to the world of what their needs are, right? But we're less likely to do that for our own needs. So being able to think about who else this is benefiting can sometimes give you a little bit more courage, not that courage isn't the right word, but, a little bit more of a backing to feel strength in fighting these systemic injustices.
Yep, sounds good. So, what was your inspiration for setting up the NeuroAccess Network? Because from personal experience, this is awesome. Can you tell us all about it?
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so there's heaps of autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent communities online, and so many of them are really great. I think finding one that suits you is so important. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the network in my space, but the one thing I felt was quite missing from what was out there is that, well, most of them were either purely like psychology led, like usually a psychologist was leading it. So very much still within the medical paradigm, even if they're neurodiversity affirming, there's a level of pathologization in how they view the world, or just maybe a lived experience community, which is, in my opinion, so valid and important because finding your neurokin and just being together can be so healing. But really, I saw this gap in needing a space where you could not only come together and, get all those benefits that all these other communities give, but also really have quite a focus on building access and empowering you to live your best life. So for me, the network is primarily about helping neurodivergent people get the tools and support they need to fight the systems in their everyday lives, whether that's employment, education, community, even, interpersonal relationships, whether, building this sense of I'm in control and I have power and I know how to set things up so that I'm not struggling. And obviously we're all going to struggle to an extent because we live in a society that is very ableist and is still really lacking in how we support neurodivergent people or even acknowledge them. But there are so many things we can actively do to make our lives better. And a lot of the time, the biggest difference besides privilege in getting there is education and being able to connect with people who can help you do it. So I help people in my one-on-one coaching, in my group coaching. That's not very accessible to a lot of people. So the community was also a way to get people in who maybe, didn't have access to NDIS funding or didn't have a lot of spare change that still really wanted to get a lot of my insights as a human rights lawyer and a professional advocate that specializes in supporting neurodivergent people, mostly adults, but I also help a lot of parents advocate for their kids as well. So to me, the network is really about helping you raise your voice, whether that's verbally or in writing, doesn't matter, but building your life to be the way you want it to be as much as possible.
Sounds fantastic.
So
to finish up, how can you sign up to learn more about the Safe Self-Advocacy method and also about NeuroAccess as well?
Yeah, so my website, neuroaccess.com.au, you can find most of the stuff on there, but my socials will be posting all about my upcoming Safe Self-Advocacy Masterclass course, which will be released at the end of August. So very shortly, which is exciting because the book won't be out until early 2025. So I know a lot of people like me really enjoy interactive courses with lots of options, from visual aids to scripts and things that they can actually actively use as practical tools. So we've been working on that for a while and that's coming out very shortly. But yeah, neuroaccess.com.au, sign up to my mailing list, follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn and Instagram are my main socials. So yeah, reach out.
Sounds good. And on that note, Annie Crowe, thank you so much for being on the Deep Dive podcast today.
You're so welcome. Thank you for doing the Deep Dive podcast. I love it. And I'm a big listener myself.
All right. Thanks, Annie. Cheers.
For more information, visit www.neuroaccess.com.au or check out the following accounts on Instagram at _Annie Crowe, at Princess Anthropy Podcast, and at neuroaccess.com.au.